Hey there guys, I am the Sixth Machine and welcome back to another Warhammer video. As announced earlier in the week, the forces of the Admech have had an update in the form of an FAQ that was released yesterday, and I'm sure many of you will already be aware that Admech have been doing pretty damn well in tournaments and events recently, possibly even outing Drukhari as the strongest faction in the game right now, thanks to an extremely complex but also incredibly multifaceted and layered set of rules and abilities that come in their codex, and that really do allow Admech forces to have multiple sets and layers of buffs that work together and support each other, which lead to their relatively cheap units overall becoming absolute powerhouses in terms of their shooting and their durability on the tabletop. And now, first off, this is incredibly cool and fluffy, and I love how much effort they put into the codex to let you do all of these varied buffing layered mechanics. It's exactly, in my opinion, how the Admech should work, but I think as a result of that complexity, there are a few interactions and rules which do appear to be a little bit oppressive, and it looks like Games Workshop have taken note of this and released a admittedly relatively small FAQ to help address some of the worst of these situations. First up, the dogma for the Lucius Forge World Solar Blessing has had a bit of a rework in that the first part, where you add 1 to any armor save made against 1 damage attacks, now explicitly does not stack while you're receiving the benefits of light cover, meaning that you can't double stack that +1 and get a +2 to your armor save if your opponent is shooting at you with a load of 1 damage weapons and you are on a terrain piece or in some light cover. So it's still good and gives you a good amount more protection as your forces advance up the board, but it just means that any unit that you're keeping back, in cover, holding an objective or anything like that won't be quite as impossible to shift as they were before. A few of the Admech stratagems have also been changed up quite drastically. Acquisition at any cost now is clarified as a once per game stratagem. So it's still really very useful, it's still a very useful stratagem to have in your back pocket, lets you automatically pass a morale test within 6 inches of an objective marker, but it just means that you can't keep doing that all game long to keep that objective in your hands. It does kind of make sense, as a lot of the morale related stratagems in the game are one use only, notably the main one from the rulebook itself, which is not only one use per game, but also comes in at 2 command points. So when you compare it to the 1 command point cost of this one does seem to be still very, very strong. This one, in my opinion, isn't a big surprise at all when it comes to this FAQ, but it certainly will make a difference not having a unit which will just never run away, no matter how many of the infantry in that squad you manage to chip away and kill. The other change to this stratagem is that it also specifies that the unit must be wholly within 6 inches. So again, this makes a lot of sense when you consider that before you could have had huge 20-man blobs of Skitarii spread out across the board and just had 1 or 2 models within that 6 inches and still being able to get the benefit of this stratagem. So this change more makes this stratagem a bit more sensible and a bit more fluffy, in my opinion, and also, as a nice aside, does help to curb against some of the potential abuse that players could take advantage of before when they used this stratagem over and over and over again. Enriched Rounds was another extremely powerful stratagem that was seeing a lot of use across Admech forces and has taken quite a bit of a nerf, not only going up to 2 command points if you use it on a unit of 11 or more models, so it doubles the cost when you use it on those big blobs of Skitarii, which in itself is a nice and logical change in my opinion. 1 CP for any unit size was a bit weird. Most stratagems in the game at the moment have that differentiation between 10 or less or 11 or more models when it comes to stratagems, so I like that change if nothing else. But in addition to that, it no longer causes automatic wounds on unmodified 4s to hit, but now only comes into effect on unmodified 5s. So this is a bit of a stronger nerf amongst everything in the FAQ, fully reducing your chance to automatically wound on a hit by about 16%. So whilst this stratagem is still very, very good, anything that causes automatic wounds on the hit rolls is a good stratagem to have in your back pocket, I would say it is still worth those 2 command points on a big squad, but it does mean that using it on those huge 20-man squads of Skitarii, much less oppressive when you're shooting, 40 shots or whatever into your enemy and having auto wounds on 4s, which was just really quite unfun to play against. So I do like this change. It is quite a substantial one, and I could understand maybe some people not being too happy with it if you're an Admech player, but realistically, the way it was before, especially for 1 command point, it was incredibly overpowered, bordering on broken, so I think this has brought it much more in line with a reasonable cost stratagem. Next up, we have another stratagem, Galvanic Volley Fire, which let your rangers change their galvanic rifles to rapid fire 2 from heavy 2. Now this was obviously a huge buff, letting you not only move and fire without penalty, but also potentially getting 4 shots on your opponent instead of 2 if you were within 15 inches. Now it has been changed so that for 2 command points, you change their weapon type to heavy 3 instead of heavy 2. It's still a solid stratagem, in my opinion, and if you think about it, outside of 15 inches, it is actually a buff to your ranges, unless they've moved around and they're getting that -1 to hit penalty, but you are getting extra shots if you are outside of 15 inches, so in some ways you could definitely consider this change a buff. But it does mean that the absolute maximum shots now is 3 per model instead of the 4 that you could have got before with the change to rapid fire, and it also does, there are ways to negate it, but it does mean that you are slightly more restricted in your mobility options. With that change, you can't just change things to rapid fire and get your full movement and not have any penalties for it. So there is a plus side and a downside to this change. I think overall, as we said before with other things in this FAQ, it makes it slightly less oppressive and slightly less unfun to play against. But if you are just keeping a unit on a backfield objective and pouring fire downrange, this actually is probably going to be a bit of a buff in the change for you. Finally, for this FAQ, another reasonably large one, both the Dragoon and the Ballistarii units lose the core keyword. This is really quite a big change, although it may not seem like it just on the face of it, but losing core means that they lose a huge amount of access to things like buffs and warlord traits and holy orders and relics and stratagems, which are specifically for core units only. So whilst the actual units of the chicken walkers themselves haven't been changed in terms of their profile or their stat line or their cost, their interaction with things like Servo Skull and Exemplars Eternity Skitarii Marshals has now gone. And what this means is that pretty much all of their access to rerolls, to hit and to wound, things like being able to get more negative AP on their weapons, being able to fall back and still shoot, are now gone. So again, this makes them so much less oppressive to play against and so much less unfun to play against, even though they are still arguably quite powerful for their points cost. Unfortunately, this does also mean that the Dragoons, which are the melee variant, which are they were probably middling in terms of usability, even with the previous changes with them having the core keyword, are almost certainly going to be relegated to the shelf now. They lose too much, in my opinion, losing the core keyword. As I said before, they were an arguable pick. Now there are just so many other better things that you can take instead of them. But it does quite fairly make the Ballistarii still very good. And let's not make any mistake, they are still very good. They are fantastic platforms for their D3 plus 3 damage las cannons, but they're just not quite as, I hesitate to say broken, but they were edging on the broken territory with all the layers of the buffs and abilities that they could access with core. So they've been reined in just a little bit, and whilst they are still arguably one of the best units in the Codex in my opinion, they're not completely broken now. So all in all, there are some fairly decent changes I think in this FAQ. It does seem as though GW has taken a somewhat gentle approach to this, which is good in some ways. They haven't just completely gutted half the units in the Codex. I would say that apart from the Dragoons, this FAQ reins in a lot of the units from the Codex without making them worthless, and in fact things like the Skitarii and the Ballistarii are still exceptionally good units for their cost. You just might not see entire armies made up of nothing but those particular units all the time now. I do think that perhaps there is still some more to do. Some things still feel a tad too favourably priced in my opinion, but that being said, you can say the same thing for a lot of codexes such as the Drukhari still, so I will be honest, I am not expecting another big FAQ that changes too much rules wise for the Admech. I believe that there will just be some more points adjustments and updates which will come with the annual chapter approved style books at the end of the year. So this has been a step in the right direction by GW, I think, in terms of reining in the really powerful stuff, but I would also fully expect some, not super huge, but certainly some significant point changes as well when we get to the chapter approved books later on in the year. But what do you think of these changes? Has this FAQ changed your Admech list at all, or are Chicken Walkers and Skitarii still well worth their points even after you've read through this FAQ? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I will catch you later, guys.